line. Love is a doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship.
Sylvia Boorstein wrote, "Life is so difficult. How can we be anything but kind?"
And so we light this chalice this morning, honoring kindness and love.
So here in the year 2023, many people indeed are heeding Kendi's call to be an anti-racist, or at least to take steps toward becoming anti-racist as part of our work to dismantle white supremacy. We are making progress, even as there is much more work to do. Indeed, just this past week, I learned that UUFD's social justice team, which had been called Healing Racism, has changed its name to the Anti-Racism Team to more accurately reflect their focus on anti-racism. Anti-racism is important work and hard work because racist attitudes, habits, and institutions have been part of American culture for centuries. Anti-racism goes against the flow of this country's history, often making it hard to imagine how to be anything other than racist. Often our racism is unconscious, not motivated by ill will at all, but it's something that's part of what we've grown up with, something that has become part of us. Now, in my experience, many Unitarian Universalists have been making good progress at challenging domineering power structures, power which gives preference to whites over people of color, as well as to straight persons over gay, or rich persons over poor, and so on. It is indeed a big job changing power dynamics, which have been part of American culture for decades. Various cultural initiatives, such as Black History Month, as we're celebrating right now in February, help a lot to create more diverse, pluralistic views of the world. In some ways, I wish that we didn't need particular holidays or recognition months to lift up Black history, or as Cheryl said, that we don't need a Valentine's Day in order to love one another. I wish we didn't need these special months, rather than demonstrating love to one another every day of the year. But still, I appreciate the engaging, the busy programming about Black history this month, as on public television and public radio. I admit that the specials and the frequent spotlighting of people of color during February reminds me to regularly examine myself for any of my conscious or unconscious biases. Along with most of my minister colleagues, I am on a long and important learning curve to plumb the extent of white supremacy's capacity to create human oppression based on skin color, and any part I play in white supremacy. We ministers were strongly encouraged to attend workshops and meetings to better promote anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. And there's many resources to help us. A book titled Centering, which I know some of you have read, some of you have looked at, includes unthinkable stories of racism just within our UU ministry. It's hard to believe. Yes, Centering. Or another recent bestseller, which I understand many of you in this congregation benefit from reading a year or two ago, a book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Or looking ahead, I also urge this congregation to consider an adult ed program called Widening the Circle of Concern, an excellent spiritual exploration of the many oppressions we humans inflict on one another. A mindset of widening the circle helps to peel away like an onion those layers of racism and other prejudices most of us carry around. There are so many layers to peel away to become anti-racist. Just when I think I understand my own part in systemic racism, I become aware of yet another layer of the onion, the need to go yet deeper. Becoming anti-racist isn't easy at all, but I hope I never can stop learning and growing in promoting equity and freedom for every person, regardless of their particular identities. We may ask how well-meaning human beings, like us, through the decades have become mired in racism and other systems of oppression. I think one helpful lens to explain how any cultural habit has developed is to learn about the origin stories attached to that habit. Now, by origin stories, I mean those explanations, whether they're true or cultural myths, for how a certain habit got started or why a certain holiday was founded. Each of us carries many origin stories within us, whether they be mythological origin stories, such as how women's emerging from the rib of man defined her as lower than or lesser than man, that origin story in the Bible, or personal origin stories, such as how a certain family ritual was started years before you were born, but that ritual is repeated every holiday season without your actually understanding how it got started. Origin stories, they're powerful because what we recognize or celebrate, we tend to live into. Origin stories can be helpful in understanding our current identity. For example, as part of the UUFD History Timeline Project, which Cheryl has mentioned over on the patio wall of this room, we reviewed some of the origin stories of this congregation. And by the way, I want to invite you again, have a look at the wall afterwards, do your own postings of your own memories of this congregation. Each of us is surely carrying within us many personal origin stories, which influence how we experience life from day to day. On the other hand, long-established origin stories may also be drawbacks if they block out possibilities for updating or expanding our understanding of any culture we're part of. We should be wary of relying on a single origin story to explain a complex history, such as the history of Black Americans. There is a persuasive and engaging TED Talk by a gifted Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The talk is called The Danger of a Single Story. So if you haven't caught her name, I encourage you to look up the title of her talk, The Danger of a Single Story. I encourage everyone to have a look at it. I had thought about including an excerpt from that talk as part of this sermon, but it really benefits from your hearing the whole thing. It runs about 25 minutes. So I encourage you to look up The Danger of a Single Story. In this video, Chimamanda Adichie, who self-describes herself as having chocolate brown skin, cautions us about relying on a single story. That is just one way, one lens, one interpretation of looking at just about everything that we experience in life. Single stories can lead to stereotyping, which is almost always incomplete. She's been subject to much stereotyping in her career as an internationally known writer. For example, her American roommate in college in the States wondered how she learned to speak English so well, when in fact, English is one of the official languages of Nigeria. She's also heard the surprise from conversation partners when she tells them that there is more to Nigeria than warfare, famine, and devastation. In fact, there's art and literature and music and lots of creativity. Or she cringes, she says, every time she hears someone refer to the country, not the continent, of Africa. She comes from the country of Africa. Yeah. Aware as she is of a single story, she also offers her own confessions of her own stereotyping. Now, she grew up in a prosperous Nigerian academic family who employed a young man from a lower income family to do housework. When she visited the young man's home, she admitted to her surprise to see a beautiful woven set of baskets in the living room made by the young man's mother. She admitted her stereotyping that because the boy's family was poor, she presumed they did not engage in creative projects, such as basket weaving, regarding any human through the lens of a single story. The other becomes that stereotyped single story in our mind. Clearly, stereotyping led to her incomplete knowledge of that young man and his family. Expanding any event or person or experience beyond a single story not only broadens our connections with others, expanding beyond a single story brings us much closer to the reality of the other, and thus how we love and honor the inherent worth and dignity of the other. There's many options for how we can expand beyond a single story. Here in this age of Kendry's anti-racism, there's many examples of how we are expanding beyond single stories. For example, you know that Monday holiday in early October, which now honors not only Christopher Columbus, but also the many indigenous residents of the New World who were already here when Columbus and other early colonizers supposedly discovered America, right? Expanding that holiday to Indigenous Peoples Day helped us move past this holiday as a single story to an appreciation of the diverse cultures who lived for centuries on those lands that Columbus and those other early explorers supposedly discovered. Or take the year 1776, long understood as the founding date of American freedom and liberty. Those are hallmarks of democracy, right? Words and concepts which were issued through Thomas Jefferson's penning the words, "All men are created equal." If any of us are confused about how this country today demonstrates freedom and equity for all persons, as we endure ongoing killings of young black men at the hands of police, perhaps realizing how the origin story of the Declaration of Independence did not include those black men in the first place. Jefferson's words evoking freedom and equity were intended for the white male Americans of a certain economic privilege. Our confidence in the content of founding documents, such as the Declaration of Independence, may ring hollow, as we realize that not only Jefferson, but 10 of the first 12 American presidents, leaders of this new country founded on this concept of democracy, owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson illustrates a famous historical figure who we do well to regard through multiple lenses, multiple interpretations, not a single story. Expanding the content of any single story, we bring more people into the story, and we break down that stereotyping about who counts and who doesn't, who's in and who's out. Chimamanda Adichie also suggests that single stories convey different information depending on where in their history we begin the story. So let's keep with the traditional founding date of American democracy, 1776. About 4 years ago, I, and probably many of you, learned a new story, a new date for the founding of this country, published by the New York Times, to identify the founding of American culture as seen through the lens of Black history, both in a Sunday newspaper format and then in a published book. The New York Times invited Americans to consider 1619, not 1776, as the founding date to define the American origin story. The paper preferred 1619 as the lens through which to view the tragedies and the challenges, as well as the triumphs and the accomplishments of American Black history. So why the date 1619? In August 1619, a Portuguese ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, near Jamestown on the coast. carrying humans of African descent as cargo. Only half of the original passengers survived the voyage. Coming from Angola, this landing marked the first delivery of human slaves to the colonies. And from then until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, the dominant American culture was defined in one way or other by slavery. Over 12 million women, men, and children worked the fields and farms in the South, encouraging the lucrative economy of sugar and cotton, encouraged by white persons of privilege. Slaves were commodities, exploited and sold like objects, not human beings. The Emancipation Proclamation represented freedom and equality, only to have slavery replaced by new forms of oppression. Blacks over whites, oppression over blacks and poor whites. Recent murders of young black men at the hands of police should be evidence that the origin story of racism established 400 years ago is still rearing its ugly head in this country. And yet, the American story of slavery and racism is not only a story about oppression, as this 1619 Project has really brought to the fore. Many inspiring essays that are part of this project note the many significant advancements in medicine, in religious life, in music, in the arts, in healthcare, even in democracy, which have emerged from American Black history, whose origin story, they say, began in 1619. To quote the New York Times, "Out of racism and anti-Black slavery came nearly everything that made America exceptional." That, to me, is a pretty awesome origin story of the United States. To place Black Americans at the center, appropriately here in Black History Month. Our American story, explained with 1619 as its origin, is a story of human survival and human progress. Viewing American history, then, with at least two dates to mark the American origin story renders our self-identity all the richer and all the more capable of inspiring a positive future. So, my friends, how do these stories of slavery's legacy expand your reflections on this challenge to become anti-racist from Ibram Kendi? It's not just enough for us to read about or talk about being more anti-racist. We must also act. We must turn our liberal theology of equality into tangible results. Getting out there in the community, as you've heard examples of this morning already from what this congregation is doing, getting out there to help the connections, to help the possibility of freedom and equity for everyone. For me, this 1619 Project has contributed at least two things to my becoming more anti-racist. For one, it's opened my perspective on how widespread and insidious racism in this country really is. Even we open-minded, liberal, fair, compassionate people, we need to continue to work at becoming anti-racist. Racism is widespread and insidious. At the same time, this 1619 Project also gives me new insight into what I can do to live more fully as an anti-racist and as someone committed to helping to dismantle white supremacy. Now, you may say these examples of slavery's legacy are just too large, beyond anything any single individual can do to bring about change. On the other hand, I truly believe that each of us can help. Each of us can make a difference in making life more equitable for everyone as we continue to explore the unrealized ways we carry around preconceived opinions about others based on physical characteristics such as race or gender or sexual orientation or ableism. What origin stories will you consider reevaluating? How does new perspective on the events of the past bring you new perspective on the present? And as you review origin stories, I hope that that review broadens your perspective on both the present and the future. I hope that this recent work on the timeline broadens and informs conversations among all of you after the service this afternoon about going forward in professional ministry. The wider and the more varied our understanding of the past, the better prepared we are to face the future, with anticipation, with energy, and as the fifth focus point of interim ministry calls us to go forward into the future with zest. My friends, may your conversation after the service be a zestful one. May all this be so.